You to be careful and take precautions to reduce the risk of infection. As you can see, we have hit the ground running this year, bringing you an exceptional lineup of leading renewable energy developers here in South Africa. They will be sharing with you the fundamentals of renewable energy project development, and you will be given an overview of project development requirements across both solar PV and wind technology projects. Site identification and land acquisition is the first step to developing a good project. We have also received many queries on this topic particularly, and will therefore spend some time getting into the details on this topic. Assessing the energy resources is key to a feasible and profitable project, and our technical experts are on hand to talk to you about both wind and solar PV separately. We will also hear from WKN Wind Current, a renewable energy project developer. They will be sharing information on their footprint in South Africa and the opportunities within the renewable energy project development space. I will thereafter conclude by handing over to my co-host, Ms. Ntomifuthi Ntuli, to facilitate a Q&A session and wrap up today's webinar. But before we start, I do need to pay the bills. So this series of webinars are in partnership with the IPP Office, BEPA, the Black Energy Professionals Association, and REEFSA, the Renewable Energy Entrepreneurs Forum of South Africa. And the series of webinars has been sponsored by Mainstream Renewable Power and Juvi Renewable Energies. Today's session particularly is sponsored by WKN Wind Current. I would now like to welcome you all to sit back and enjoy the esteemed panel of speakers. I encourage you all to participate by way of questions. Please provide your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, and these will be addressed at the end of the session during the facilitated Q&A session. If the speakers don't mind, in the essence of time, I'm going to skip over the speaker bios. The speaker bios can be found on the slides when we are introducing the speaker. They have been sent out on the invitation, and they are available upon request. If you have a job opening for any of the speakers, I'm happy to send you their CVs as well. So without further ado, let me hand over and welcome Ms. Chanda Kumalo, who is the Director of Harmattan Renewables. She will be speaking on the development of solar PV projects.
Thanks, Nivesh. Kim, I think you can skip it. I don't need to look at my face. Hi, everybody. Happy New Year, and welcome to the webinar. Hopefully, we'll address some of your questions. Feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll try and answer them. Maybe just to contradict one thing Nivesh said, I think everybody else on here is from approaching this from a development point of view. I'm one of the dreaded consultants, so Harmattan is a technical consultancy. So I've kind of approached this from a slightly different point of view in that it's looking at what we see when we are doing due diligence on projects, either for lenders or for companies acquiring projects, and so how you ought to structure your project in order to get it to fruition. So I'll do a very brief introduction to Harmattan. Kim, you can just skip to the next slide, thanks. So Harmattan Renewables, as I said, is a technical consultancy. We work across the life cycle of renewables, right from early stage feasibility studies, energy yield assessments, through the construction, due diligence, and operations of projects. And some of our goals are basically enhancing the performance, improving efficiency, and minimizing risk on projects. You can go to the next slide, Kim. I won't go into this too much, but we're a Black women-owned company that has been operating in South Africa since 2012. And as I said, we cover the life cycle. So this will all be in the slides when you get them. You can jump up to the next slide, Kim. Okay, so project development. Project development really is like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and you're trying to get all of the pieces to fit. And sometimes you have some pieces and then other pieces are missing and you're searching for them. So what I've tried to do in this presentation is to give you a framework for how you need to consider project development. And the one that I've found most useful is one that's been developed by NREL, which is the National Renewable Energy Laboratories in the US. And so you'll see in the slide, they have a definition of what project development ought to cover, which is site, resource, offtake, permits, technology, team, and capital. And so we'll go through each of those and discuss them. But I've also put in here, and this is from an IFC document, which for those of you wanting to get into solar project development is very useful. They've done a very comprehensive document looking specifically at solar PV project development. And these are the different stages as they define them, starting from site identification through pre-feasibility and feasibility, and then through to getting finance and detailed design. So Kim, you can jump to the next slide. So I've kind of reordered it because, as I said, I am looking at this from the point of view of how you need to project, no, back one, please. Yeah, how you need to package your project with the end in mind, because ultimately, as a developer, you'll need to get your project financed. And so the lenders are the last hurdle once you've developed a project. And so you need to consider how they are going to assess the project and basically prepare your project from the beginning for due diligence, which means you need to ensure that all of the paperwork is in place, all of the documents have been collated properly, that the development is done to international standards as far as possible. This is because getting project finance on your project is a bit like getting a mortgage on your house. So the security for the lenders on your project is, on the loan is your project. So they want to minimize the risk as far as possible, because all of their cash flows and them getting paid back is based on how your project is set up, what the risks are, what the inputs are, and how much energy it's going to produce to allow you to sell it. So you're going to set up the project under a special purpose vehicle, and ideally, and again, I'm saying this because, so for those of you who know these things and wouldn't make these silly mistakes, forgive me, but we've seen this a lot of times, is that you develop the project under a personal name, or you develop it under your own personal company, and then you have to go through a whole process of transferring contracts, etc. So ideally, set up the project under a special purpose vehicle, which is a dedicated vehicle for the project under development. And this project will then be funded via equity and then eventually through debt. The equity initially is you as the project developer, what the money that you're putting towards it, often sweat equity, so the work that you're doing and for the project, and then you'll later bring in other equity providers. And then debt, be that the commercial banks or the multilateral international banks. So ideally, and you'll see in that sentence below, you need to undertake studies as early as possible, just to minimize the risk and prepare your project for due diligence, either by an incoming equity provider or by the debt providers. So as I said, we're framing everything going forward on this basis. So Kim, you can go to the next slide. This is just a quick one on the project costs and how those ramp up. And as you'll see, why I'm using that capital, back one, the capital as the main focus is that the majority of the investment occurs basically at financial close or over construction, and it's the lenders that take that. So you as the developer have smaller spend upfront, and then we go through to the construction. Okay, you can jump to the next one. So going back to our framework that we were looking at, the first thing that you need in order to have a solar project is a site. Back. So the site here, most of what I'm going to talk about during this is more focused on utility scale projects, however, applies also for rooftop projects and for commercial and industrial projects, so embedded generation projects. You will always need to have a site on which to put your equipment and your project. So here's a few options of the kinds of sites that you might be looking at. So a greenfield site, think a field and an agricultural land or land that hasn't been used before, building integrated projects, ground mounted projects that are on commercial industrial parking lots. So you'll have seen, Macro, for example, have the solar projects in their carports, and then brownfield sites, which we're discussing a bit more in South Africa at the minute. So looking at old mines or landfill sites and rehabilitating those. Okay, next one, Kim. So once you've selected what type of project you're doing, then you need to understand your site. And there's quite a few bits of that jigsaw puzzle that we were talking about that you need to understand. So is there land available? What is the land used for? Zoning in particular, and I won't go into too much detail on the land because my colleagues are going to speak more about that later. But what is the land used for? Does it need to be rezoned? If it's high performing agricultural land, then do you want to then utilize that for a solar PV project, or can it have more functional uses? What are the ground conditions of the site? So this will feed into your designs later on for looking at your foundations and whether you need to do detailed geotech studies on the site. If there's wetlands and water bodies around, all of these feed into your permitting, what the climate on the site is and how that will affect both your design, but also your energy resource. Access, you need to be able to get to the site. And what people often forget is you don't just need to be able to get to the site when you construct it, you also need to be able to get to the site during operations. So make sure that that is available through the life of the project. Environmental situation, so you will have to do, unless it's a smaller project that you can do a basic assessment, you'll have to go through a full environmental impact assessment on the site. Is there a grid connection? I mean, you need to be able to sell your power in order, and we'll come back to that later. Therefore, you need to be able to connect to a grid, and how that, the cost, the capacity that's available on that are all important factors to consider in selecting your site. I've put in here the link for the strategic environmental assessment, the red zones that are exist in South Africa. So you know, if you put a project in one of those, then you can slightly speed up the process in terms of environmental assessments. What flora and fauna and wildlife are on the site, which will impact where you can put equipment and how you design it. Archaeology, are there any areas of heritage? Is there water? And also what's the competition around? So you'll see in the picture on the left, generic map. So the land we're saying is suitable in the green, and there happens to be 2 towns nearby, a river and a road. Okay, you can go to the next one. And in your design, you're going to have to put your site a certain distance from each of these, because too close to a road or too close to a river, you're going to have issues. So we mark off the boundaries or the buffers around each of these, and then we have the remainder of the land in green that's still available. And this is done, you can go to the next slide. As a project developer, I said it's like a jigsaw puzzle, but the thing about development is it's also iterative. So you don't just suddenly, we're still on the one before, please. You're not just going to suddenly pick a site. You go through different processes and look at the different criteria. So on the left here, we said we had the list of things that we need to understand about our site, but you can look at that on a countrywide basis from the GIS. So the grid network, the REDs, the EIA applications, and the competition, and then put all of those together and find where the available areas are that are most competitive. So you can go to the next one. So once you've done all of that and gone through your various iterations, you're left with a suitable area, which here is marked out in the box in yellow. And this essentially is to get you to what the available capacity is that you can build, or the number of megawatts that you can build. And again, we go back to that capital. So you're doing all of this to understand what the return on investment could be. So you need to know the size of the project, and therefore how much you could expect in terms of revenue based on the different costs that you could have for the project. So once you've got that area, then you can do a preliminary high-level design to understand how many megawatts you could fit into that site and whether it's viable, and in your iterative process to go ahead. Okay, Kim, next one. So the next one on our framework is the resource. And again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because you'll have a bit more detail. No, I'm still on it. Kim? I think we can't see.
I apologize for that, Chanda. I think there's a technical difficulty with the slides. We're just changing over So Marilise can take over this one.
Okay, I'll just talk about the resource one while you're doing that one. So the resource one, I don't propose to go into too much detail about, but essentially you need to understand how much energy you can produce from your site, and the inputs to that. If you could you put it on the full slide, on slide 17, please. Next one. Yes, perfect. So you need to understand what the resource is on your site, and depending on what stage you are at in the development, just back one, please. What stage you're at in the development, there's different levels of detail and certainty that you need surrounding the resource. So you go from the resource to what your energy yield is going to be in the project, and that will then feed back into your revenue estimates. But as I said, my colleagues are going to go into much more detail about how to do a full energy resource assessment, so I won't go into that here. Okay, you can jump to the next one. The next area on our framework is the offtake. So in South Africa, we have the REIPP process, which allows under a tender setup for you to sell power directly to Eskom. But essentially what the bank will look for when they're funding your project is a power purchase agreement of some sort, or the ability to sell power to an entity. And again, remember, all of this comes down to your project being bankable. So under the offtake, you need the agreement with whoever that entity is. Ideally, they need to be a credit-worthy off-taker, so the bank will look at whether they're going to be able to pay you for that power over the life of the project. How long are you selling power to them for? Ideally, for as long as you have put in your financial model, ideally 20 years. If they're smaller projects, it'll be less. How are you going to pay the bank back? So what is your tariff? And your tariff should allow you to earn more than the costs of operating and running the project. Do you need to wheel? So wheeling is slightly controversial in South Africa at the minute, but something that I believe is moving forward and coming. So are you going to sell from a project to a purchaser in a different location? And net metering, which is something that we have in different areas of the world, but is not such a big thing here in South Africa. But ensuring that you have an offtake agreement signed up before you get to financial close. Okay, next one. Okay, then the next one on our framework is the permits, and it seems obvious to say, but yeah, they need to be in place. Often you will have a project that there are applications in place for, or not all the permitting has been completed. And really this is a checking the box exercise, because the lenders will want to see this. You need to meet the requirements, the local requirements, so all of the South African requirements. And if you're getting funding from a multilateral or a development finance institution, you will likely need to meet the Equator Principles and IFC standards requirements. I've put a list on the left-hand side here. This covers both solar, and then some of them are more wind focused, but a list of the permits that you need to go through. And this is an exercise in project management, really, and what is part of the skill of being a developer is ensuring that you can get these permits in place, and just ensuring that they're in place for everything that you need. So again, what we see often is people will permit the modules, the panels, and the footprint of the panels, but forget that they need to run cables from one point to another, or that the access roads have not been approved, or the grid connection. So you have to ensure that every part of your project is covered within the permits. Okay. Can go to the next one. Leases, again, I think Marsha is going to go into this in a lot more detail, but what we would look at on behalf of the lenders is the length of the lease, and make sure that it covers you for the whole life of the project, and what are the areas that are covered, and what rights are granted to you as the developer. So where can you build? Can you have borrow pits? What do you owe to the landowner in terms of their rights, and what are they allowed to do on the land? And then again, one that seems silly, but is it signed? So this is something that we, again, often see that you have a document, but it hasn't actually been ratified. You can jump to the next one. I won't go into detail on that. And then we look at the technology and the design. So you've got the area that you want to build your project on. Yeah, that one, thank you. That you want to build your project on. And in order to get the size of the project, you need to do an outline system design. So again, iterative process, look at the various design configurations and try to optimize them for your site. So your goal in all of this is to maximize the possible revenue and minimize the risks under the project. So you're trying to optimize the design so that your project is essentially going to be able to deliver as much power as practically possible with the site that you have. Looking at shading requirements on the site, looking at O&M requirements. And again, this is something that often developers forget, is that you're going to develop the project, then it has to be built, and then for 20 years. So take those things into consideration. Is there enough spacing for you to fit a vehicle in between the rows so that you can clean panels? How are you going to get a lawnmower in between, or a rad-on lawnmower in between, so that you can cut grass, et cetera, et cetera. So taking all of these things into consideration upfront just means that your project is more likely to run as you have predicted it will over the life of the project. So one outline system design, next stage is then detailed site plan. So remember at the beginning we said do studies as early as possible. And so often as a developer, we look to minimize the costs upfront, and this can end up costing more later in the life of the project. So there is a balance to be struck, but the more detail that you can get and the more levels of certainty on what ground types there are, the contours and the topography of the site, and whether there are floodplains, and the requirements for your balance of plant contractor in terms of civil works and your electrical works, that will cost you less later on in the life of the project. Next. Then just a second quick one in terms of technology. So you've done your design, but there's also various options in terms of the technology that you can select. So again, it comes down to bankability. So if we look, there's three there that we, the module selection, the inverter selection, the type of mounting frame and tracker. So under the modules, there's different options that you can look at. Monofacials, bifacials are getting more traction in the South African market at the minute. From lenders' point of view, often they want to know that something has either track record or proven certification. So it's important that you take all of these things into consideration when you're choosing your modules. There's a balance again to be struck between track record, local content, who your suppliers are, the warranties of those modules as well, and what they will give you, and then the financial standing of the company that you're buying from. Similar applies to your selection of inverters. You can jump to the next one, which is then just looking at the different types of mounting that you can have. Most frequently in South Africa, we see the single axis tracker, although there are fixed tilt systems. It's okay, you can jump to the next one. And then finally is the team that you assemble to develop the project. So everybody cannot do everything. And again, in the interest of a balance of expenditure versus expenditure versus risk, try and surround yourself with people that understand project development, have taken projects through the process, have taken projects through financial close. They don't have to be employed by you full time. You can bring people in for specific areas that you need, so specific specializations at different points. But just try to ensure that you have a team with a track record. Again, lenders like to see that experience in a team if they are lending to them, equity investors as well, that they're investing in an experienced team with knowledge that can ensure that the project gets to completion. So that is a whirlwind tour through PV project development. Thank you. I'm sure Ntombi will have questions later on for me.
Thank you very much, Chanda. I apologize for the technical glitches on the presentation. My team has been looking as to what went wrong, and we see that a timer has sneaked into the slide presentation. So they've now removed that, and hopefully it
That
will
was
be a
probably
little
my
bit more
fault, to
smooth.
be honest.
Thank you for that. So thank you, Chanda. I think you've covered for us the key steps in project development, and you've also provided a number of tips on how to handle particular challenges or hurdles that come up when you're trying to develop a project. I think what's very interesting for me is that you've touched on understanding the RFP of the Renewable Energy IPP procurement program. You've talked about the financial perspective, the financial requirements, the financiers' requirements, and the lenders' requirements quite a bit, and also the legal perspective in terms of the legal requirements. And these are all sessions that we had as part of this series of webinars that covered those in detail. And I see it also creeps back into project development. So it's good for those of you who are following the series that they will all start to make sense and fit together when you're trying to put your development team together to make these projects work. Our next speaker is Jacobus Chirnick. I hope I'm saying that right.
It's Chirnick.
Chirnick. There you go. And you're going to be talking to us about developing wind energy projects. So over to you.
Yes, that is correct. Thank you very much, Nivishan, and all of the people attending, the participants. Thank you very much for joining. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. I think we can skip past this little intro of myself and just going to jump right into where Chanda has now very well explained how renewable energy development for solar works. I'm going to focus on developing wind energy projects. First, I'm just going to have a quick little brief introduction. I'm from G7 Energies. Next slide, please. So yeah, G7 Renewable Energies. We are active wind energy developer. Previous slide, please. Active renewable energy developers, specifically initially focused on wind. So that is how we made our name. And my section of the development process is definitely looking into land rights and the economic development of the company. Economic development, very specifically something that you have to look in later in the process. I'm actually a town and regional planner, which just comes to show that anyone can really enter this market, and there's opportunities for everybody. And I've been involved since 2012, when we really started seeing how the development has on a policy basis been implemented in South Africa, and when we really started seeing land use changes happening, especially in terms of solar. So yeah, next slide. Enough about myself. I'm going to, unlike Chanda, which has gone into a lot of detail and definitely have a more technical perspective, I think I'm going to focus more later on in the presentation on the opportunities and challenges that we see in the wind development industry. But in terms of your development requirements, I'm going to try and keep it really short and sweet and just focus on the fundamentals. And what I cannot stress enough is that the base data that you have at your disposal to start your development process, to do your pre-feasibility studies, to start looking for investment opportunities is of critical importance. And I break that down into three components. First and foremost is that land is important. And in South Africa, land is broken up into cadastral properties. So having the cadastral data of South Africa at your disposal, which links to the deeds registry in the country and which will direct you to any landowner in the country, is of critical importance. Then, of course, I'm just going to switch those two around. What is important is having data about your wind resources. Now, my colleague Inga is going to discuss more about the wind resources, but obviously, when you want to develop, you want to go to where the highest potential wind energy resource is in the country. Now, we have various atlases that gives you access to that. There's wind simulators, which combine the wind resource data that you collect over time as your pre-feasibility through meteorological masts, and also interpolate that with topography, which gives you hotspots in the country where to focus. Now you've got the wind. Now you've got that as resource. You know you want to put up your wind towers, your turbines, but where you're going to go with all that electricity that's being generated? And hot topic, of course, Eskom and South Africa's grid infrastructure. So Where do we have grid connection points? There's no use in developing a renewable energy project or a wind project specifically 50 kilometers away from a grid connection point, or as we commonly say, substations, and there's no capacity because you're going to see losses and there's going to be no way for you to evacuate the power. Chanda, if you would excuse me that I constantly refer back to you, but she has so delicately placed it where you have the different layers of GIS data. So you can basically, it's basically cutting out the areas. And that cadastral grid and wind resources, those 3 sections is a critical component of that. Right, now you know where your wind is, now you know where you want to develop. Now you're going to need land. Land is basically the basis of all renewable energy development. Now, our colleague Moesha Grimbeek, sorry for that mispronunciation, is going to focus on that in more detail, but I do, since my title is Land Right Manager, just want to touch on 5 points. I think what we always need to understand in South Africa is that land is a sentimental thing. It's a sentimental thing to the owners. People hold the value of land. We see it in our politics. We see it in our policy. And therefore, it is also an expensive component. People want something in return for it. And that's important. Nothing wrong with that. So yeah, you want to see that you want to see that being respected in your process. And you want to see that also coming to the foreground where people are adequately compensated. So I think it's also there that we must focus, especially when we look at sentiments, that when you are identifying land and when you are acquiring land and going to these landowners to get from them the security of tenure, that you focus on them as people. These are people that you need to build a relationship with. These are people, the development process is not a short thing. It's not a quick in and a quick out. It's going to be a relationship that's probably going to last you well into 30 years. Sometimes development takes up to 10 years. And we'll go to that in terms of how you need patience. And then obviously your power purchase agreement, which is where you do your sale of electricity, lasts 20 years. That's a long time. So you best start off that relationship on the right foot. So security of tenure, once again, back to financing. No investor and no financing company is going to give you to go ahead with these projects, but if you don't have security of tenure. Chano pointed out, make sure that contract is signed. There's so many times where we see people, or that you have all the documents. You see people sign the contract, and when it comes to registration, they turn around and say, I don't really want to give you this, the registration documents. And then that's a whole different legal battle that you don't want to get into. The question of costs, I raised that earlier. I'm just saying it again. People want money in exchange for their land. Now, here's the big problem is the fact that renewable energy development projects often only generate most of their income later. And it's a very difficult balancing act to make sure that all of these things balance out onto one another. Right. And then last but not least, connection to the grid. I'm saying it's buying beyond boundaries. We often forget that you're not always in the lucky position that your project is developed right next to a grid connection point. So what you want to see at the end of the day is that where those people between your project and the grid connection point needs to have a power line built over their property, you need to understand that that relationship and their land is also something that you need access to. Right, next. More development requirements. Now that was a little bit more technical. Well, not even remotely technical, but it was a little bit more paper orientated. Whereas here I want to touch on the softer issues. Human resources. Developing a renewable energy plant, developing a wind farm is not a one-man show. You're going to need engineers. You're going to need planners. You're going to need lawyers. You're going to have all of these people on your team. And at the end of the day, what you want is people that's well-versed or that can give you the right advice. They don't need to be part of your team on a permanent basis, but you need access to that resource. It's of critical importance. Next to that, I want to put patience. It's not something I'm always great at, but the thing about patience is, as I said earlier, you don't have a quick fix in this development. You start a process, you take it from pre-feasibility, then you take it through all of the hassles, you take it through the permitting process, and then you wait for the bidding rounds, the government bidding rounds, then there's politics at play. The development process becomes expansive in time, and you need to be able to stay there for a very long time. And with that patience, then also comes the question of financial resilience. Can you maintain that time? Do you have the financial backing? Does your investors understand that this isn't going to be a quick in and out? Do they understand the length of the process, and will they be able to continue to back you for that time? That brings you to the next point, like the tenacity. You need to be tenacious like a honey badger, because if you're going to give up, you're not going to make this happen. If you're going to give up, you're going to fail. You need to be able to stick it out and make this work. And therefore, you must have commitment to the cause and truly believe in renewable energy industry. I don't think it's a place for a developer to come in and to say, you know, this looks like it's the big new boom industry. We're just going to get in here and get out. Renewable energy, I think, is a lifestyle, and it's also a commitment that you make not only to the cause of energy security, but also to the planet in itself. Next slide. Right, permitting. Okay, now I'm going to get into the really boring stuff. I'm just going to quickly touch on the main things that you need for a wind farm. I put that big red door there because we all know the red tape of bureaucracy. This is your access point to the process. Most importantly, the following you need in hand: National Environmental Management Act approval. We call it environmental authorization. This is a lengthy process. It can take anything from 2 years to 4 years. Sometimes you get more than one appeal on it. It stretches on to 5 years that you need that. And you best understand that you will not be able, in most cases, to bid without environmental authorization in place. So this is one of the items that has the longest lead times. I'm going to follow this slide with more detail as to all the studies that forms part of the environmental assessment that you do. But I just need you to focus that when you're looking at your team, that you also make sure that you have environmental specialists and access to environmental specialists. Now, there's many of them in South Africans. It's also a very strongly woman-empowered industry in our country, and I'll get back to that later. I also just want to say, and Tommy specifically asked me to look at costs. Now, this permitting is where the most of your cost is going to be initially to get to the point of having a bid-ready development. Now, national environmental impact assessments can take almost $500,000 to R1 million to work with. So that's a lot of capital input that you have to make. Then it was touched on the rezoning. That's where you look at the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, SPLUMA. Now, SPLUMA is a relatively new legislation. We used to have different legislations for different provinces, but now we have a nationalized legislation. This is where you direct the land use, as the name states. Can you farm, or can you build an industry, or can you build a business on a certain property? And what we had to do in terms of wind energy, because we are so strongly rooted in the cause that we can have both wind farms and agriculture on the same property without the negative displacement of the two, we had to get creative in terms of that policy as well. On top of that, if you're going to only lease a section of land, you have to have the Subdivision of Agricultural Land Act approval in your hand. It's Act 70 of 1970. We call it SALA. As a developer, you will hear that name time and time again. And then we have the CAA, Civil Aviation Act, because you're building massive towers with massive blades that can reach the heights of 205 meters and even higher. And we just continue to grow. You don't want aeroplanes to fly into that. And something that I found quite interesting that I never thought of until I got into the industry was proximity to radar stations. Across South Africa, we have what we call ATNS radars. They basically do the navigation for planes on your main flight routes. There's a big ones on the escarpment. You see them across the country. And if you put turbines too close to that, it's going to get confused, and it's going to tell that Boeing to fly into the ground instead of taking you to Joburg. So these are the kind of things that you need to consider. These are the kinds of things you need to stay away from. And then when all of that is in place and you get closer to the point where you're actually going to develop, then you need a cost estimate letter from Eskom to say, hey guys, we know that you don't have the money necessarily to build this connection infrastructure, but what is it going to cost us as the private sector to build it for you and then transfer it over? Next slide, please. More permitting. I won't go into so much detail with this one. I just want to touch on all the things that you need to consider when you are doing your national environmental impact assessments. Quickly running through it, you have to look at your agricultural potential of the land, birds and bats, ecology, water use. Now, birds and bats, very controversial point in wind farm development. You have nesting grounds of certain bird species, you have bats and their flight paths, and there is the issue that there's a conflict here. And so you need to do detailed studies. You have to do detailed bird and bat monitoring to make sure that when you place your turbines, that you mitigate the risks that these turbines might hold to the avifaunal ecology in the area. Water use is not such a big issue. Geotechnical, what you often find is that you're building a massive structure, so you need to have the proper foundations for it. Traffic impact during your construction phase, it's a big hassle, lots of dust generated, neighbors are unhappy, farmers are unhappy because they can't drive their roads, or the roads are just, destroyed in the process, and you have to mitigate all of that. Noise impact, I don't know how many of you participating here has standed close to a turning turbine, but it does have a noise implication. Personally, I think it's soothing and beautiful, but of course I'm biased. So there's a visual impact. It's a massive high structure. There's a socioeconomic impact. Are we going to create jobs? What are the positive impacts? What are the negative impacts? You have to look at the heritage and cultural landscape. We're not going to place turbines on top of Table Mountain, for instance. Archaeology. Are there anything that needs protected? Paleontology, and then also electromagnetic interference. We have telecommunications, we have satellite communications, we have Telcom, we have Centec, we have Vodacom, you have the military radios. And all of these signals get deflected if there's a turbine in the path. So we need to consider all of them in our development. Next slide, please. Nice. Now I'm at the softer issues, which I like the most. Wind power, wind energy development has a massive amount of opportunities that it can bring to South Africa. I think some of the highlights for me is how women empowerment is a big thing in renewable energy sector as a whole, and also in wind. There's a big drive for initiatives like the Global Wind Energy Council that drives women in wind energy in South Africa. And I think that is really something that we need to focus on. We are innovative industry. We are definitely an industry that's growing and pulling a lot of interest, and therefore we must take this opportunity to address the matter of empowerment of women. Now that's fresh coming from me because here I'm sitting, I'm a guy, but definitely if you look at larger companies, you will see that there's a lot of female important role players in leadership position industry, and I think it's something that we must positively continue to support. Then a name or a word or a term that's on everybody's lips is the just transition. If we are going to see shifts at the end of the day where we have a shifting power generation from the coal fields, power generation from fossil fuels into a new and developing industry, we need to understand that there must be an uptake. There must be an uptake of job opportunities for people where there's a disruption. We need to use this as an opportunity to educate people in new technologies and to stay at the forefront of technology in South Africa and not get left behind. So that's one of the opportunities that we capture in the just transition. Of course, it's a topic with a lot of detail and there's extensive debates around it, but I'm not an expert in the field, and I just thought, let's just look at it as something that to touch base on. Obviously, I said energy security innovation. We are in the middle of load shedding again. We have energy systems under pressure. And with the innovative application of renewable energy, wind power, solar power, a combination of them, hybrid technologies, this is definitely an opportunity that we must grab. Environmental protection. This boils down to the fact that there's definitely a much less negative impact in terms of large-scale environmental destruction brought about by renewable energy. And I know it's up for debate. I am aware of the fact there's a lot of arguments against it. But just if you look at CO2 pollution, this is definitely the way to go. Then, this is something very important, and it comes back into the just transition. Economic development drivers. Now, when you do a renewable energy project or a wind project specifically in the REEP program or the RMIPPP program, there's a lot of things you need to consider in terms of economic development. And the important things that they want from you, and they basically force you to look into is, how is your project over the course of its 20-year lifetime, the revenues generated by it, how is it going to make contribute to education and skills? You have to apply your mind as to how in the industry you can grow education, how you can send more people to university or other learnership programs. And it does not necessarily have to happen only in the town where your project happens. I saw something about the delineation of the rates and the impact on that. The location of the project does not necessarily have to be the specific place where investment takes place. It can take place broader. It's considered on a local level, a provincial level, and a national level. We look at empowerment. We look at the empowerment of youth. You look at employing more people that's in the youth category, employing more people that's Black women, people with disabilities. Very important stuff. And then one of my favorites is local content, because this is once again where we have a new energy industry developing in a country that requires new equipment, it requires new manufacturing plants. And if we can maintain those manufacturing or basically stimulate that in South Africa, that is where you're going to see job creation, that is where you're going to see growth, and that is where you're going to see sustainability. Right. Boils down to job creation. As I said, it's not only physically working on the energy plant, on the wind farm that creates jobs, but it's also in terms of creating jobs in manufacturing and the spin-off jobs that grow from it. Then a nice one, which I quite enjoy paying attention to, is enterprise development. So enterprise development is where you say, okay, besides looking at my own supply chain, where I'm going to develop wind farms and who's going to provide equipment and services to the wind farm itself, let's look at other small startups that qualify. Startups with 51% Black ownership and up, startups with 100% women ownership. You look at these criteria and these development drivers, you look at these categories and you say, okay, some of my revenue on an annual basis for the life of the project, I will invest on that. Those are the opportunities and those are the positives that we must focus on. Then I want to move on to the challenges. On the next slide, yes. One of the biggest things that stands in the way of development of renewables and the continued development of is policy uncertainty. It is very difficult to basically tell investors to hold on for 10 years if they thought this is going to be a 5-year process. If you say to an investor that I want to develop in the REEP program and then the REEP program's bidding windows get delayed, you start getting a problem, and that is where you see divestment. Investors, banks, and even all of us participants here that want to develop, before you jump into the industry, you want to have certain certainties. And that is why it's very important that we look at how policy speaks to the continued and sustained development of renewable energy development and the uptake of its electricity in the grid. Just as much as the just transition is an opportunity, it is also a challenging factor because it is very difficult to take people from one industry and to absorb them fully into another. It's not that clear cut. Wind energy and solar energy resources isn't necessarily uniform across the country. So all of that integration brings a challenge into committing to the just transition. And it takes a very, 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 very much creative thought and policy to see how to make the best of that. Then you have prohibitive requirements. I mean, just that whole list of permitting that I just went through should be sufficient enough to tell you about the prohibitions, but also, you know, certain things that make it difficult for certain developments to enter. The proximity of substations, the capacity of the grid, the fact that to upgrade the grid, you need to pay for it yourself. That's difficult. Environmental trade-offs. I'm going to take a step back and I say, okay, we're looking at the fact that renewable energy development and wind farms don't have CO2 emissions as large as fossil fuels. But on the other hand, there's an issue with bird flight paths and bat flight paths. In my free time, I also lecture at Cape Tech and I do environmental management there. And one of the things that I always open my lectures with is, unfortunately, there can be no development without an environmental footprint. It's just a question of how we manage it and how we choose the trade-offs. So that's a very important message for me. A big challenge that we have, as there are also opportunities, are the economic development requirements that we must adhere to when we develop our projects. Local content is very difficult. It's very difficult to say, okay, I'm going to reach a certain percentage of local content components manufactured in South Africa if the industry has not been sustained for the critical mass and the critical demand to exist for a manufacturing plant to actually be placed in South Africa. So once again, that interplay of the policy uncertainty has seen that kind of challenge that we have to comply to the economic development requirements, while simultaneously there's aspects that make that very difficult to adhere to. Job creation is also very difficult. One of the issues is that we don't always in the process have enough time to do the upskilling. So when you create the jobs, you often sit with the problem that during the construction phase, you use a large amount of unskilled workers, which is not ideal because it's not sustainable. And then also on the other side, you also find that it's because of certain educational constraints that it's difficult to find highly skilled workers, even in South Africa, that you need for certain development components. But that is a long discussion in its own right. Then, of course, there's the industry image. There's a lot of lobbying going around. There's the landowner expectations. They expect their money tomorrow. They now signed this contract for land. Where's my money? I need it sooner. And then there's also the process timelines. I've touched on it a few times. It takes a lot of time to develop a project. People that want the landowner expectations placed into that again, they're like, this should have been faster. Why don't I see income generated yet? Communities are asking you, why haven't the promises that you've made been seen in the community yet? It all takes time. And so often we don't have the time. And the bidding rounds and when the timing is going to be right doesn't often align. Big challenges that we need to look at. And then, next slide, please. That's me coming to an end. I know I've rushed through it a little bit, but in the middle of the process, I realized that I have a little bit more to say than the time allows. So please feel free to ask questions afterwards.
Thank you, Jacobus. Just a reminder to everyone to use the Q&A function to pose your questions. All of the panelists have agreed to stay on for the Q&A session, so they will address those questions at the end of today's webinar. So although there are many overlaps between the processes of developing wind and PV projects, there are a number of unique nuances that really matter. And this is what we should pay attention to. So I'd like to thank Jacobus for covering the hard technical and regulatory aspects, as well as the softer aspects and the opportunities within project development. I think what you would have noticed in both our speakers' presentations is that we have seen them stress on site identification and land acquisition. And therefore, we've decided or we've requested Moshe Grimbeck, who is the head of project development at Innetrag, to provide us with a presentation particularly focused on site identification and land acquisition. Over to you, Moshe.
Thank you, Niveshan, and thank you to everyone who's joined this afternoon. I think we can skip to the next slide, please. And in the interest of time, we'll just dive right in. You can go to the next one. Thank you. So today's session, I'd really want us to focus on these key areas: locality, types of land acquisition, contractual matters, and stakeholder engagement. And both my colleagues Chanda and Jacobus have stressed to us that we should look at the considerable amount of factors that need to be taken into account during the development of wind and solar. And there's a significant financial investment along a very extended time frame when we compare that to other investment methods. Next slide, please. So if we look at what we touched on earlier, we have lots of land in South Africa, but how do we decide what areas we should be focusing on? And as both Jacobus and Chanda mentioned, these are the key factors that we take into consideration. What is the resource availability? How close to grid are we? What is the grid connectivity like? And not just the proximity, but is there capacity? That's important. We look at the overlay of renewable energy development zones, and Jacobus has touched on the importance of the just energy transition. And this has focused us as developers to not look at historically what I would call low-hanging fruit. We would look, oh, where's the resource the best in terms of wind? Oh, it's along the eastern coast. Where's the resource the best for solar in the Northern Cape? It's forced us to reevaluate where we are going to acquire land and what still falls within the ideal for development, even though it does not necessarily tick the box for the most optimal resource availability. Next slide, please. So what we need to look at in terms of the types of land that we have for renewable energy projects, typically, and the most popular is privately owned land. And this is typically agricultural land or industrial land. It can also be installed on municipal land and then communal land as well. And we find that these are the main land opportunities for utility scale. And that's important to remember. Chanda mentioned in her slide, when you're not doing utility scale, the other options that you have available. As Jacobus mentioned, we need to look at factors such as your cadastral maps. These will tell you at a glance what the land portions are. And once we have those cadastral maps outlined, we can then access resources such as your CIPC and WinDeed that are wonderful tools for you to look at who those landowners can start the engagement process. And I say the term engagement process because it is about relationships, and we'll talk about that in a lot more detail. Next slide, please. What is very, very important to consider, both of our previous presenters clearly enforced what is required in terms of financing a project and the types of financing we're going to require, and not just meeting local requirements, but meeting international finance requirements. Although we have an obligation to have local investment, and we're increasing on that, all of the fundamental financing regulations are internationally based as well. And what really is important is the lease agreement, because we need to know that if you look at the amount of investment that you're spending over a period of 7 to 10 years for a development, you cannot get to a bid stage in the REEF round where you've spent millions of rands developing a project and the lease agreement that you have is not suitable. I mean, Jacobus and Chanda mentioned practical things like, is it signed? You know, does the wording in the lease agreement, does it comply with what the financial institutions or the lawyers doing your legal due diligence, is it going to comply with those? So recommendation is do your utmost to obtain a lease agreement from reputable legal sources. And we're always trying to find that balance between initial outlay for development. But I think one should bear in mind one factor. Without land, you have no project. And you can lose significant investment if you don't have the right legal access to that land. Ensure that you know what type of party you are contracting with. It's really wonderful. You meet the farmer, you meet the individual who owns the land, it's industrial, you sign your lease agreement, and then you take a look later, oh, did this person have the right to sign the contract? Were they empowered to sign the contract? Is there a resolution? Is it a company that I'm trading with? Is it a trust that I'm trading with? Is it an individual? And for each of those, there's this required supporting documentation. So it's fundamentally important that you really identify who the other contracting party is in this. And also remember that because of the length of time that you are engaging with the landowner, sometimes there's a change of ownership. You then need to be able to go back and check that your option to lease, your material lease agreement, A, allows for that change in ownership, and B, the new owner, do I have all of the required supporting documentation that I can conclude this lease with? If it's a trust, do we have the letter of authority to ensure that the person signing on behalf of the trust is empowered and authorized to conclude that transaction? And what might seem insignificant at the time of concluding the lease, because we're all excited that one can access this land portion and start development. If you don't tick all of those little boxes right in the beginning, it becomes a very expensive exercise and a time-pressured exercise when you're in a bid process or trying to achieve financial close on your project. What's also important to remember is that you need to look at the types of servitudes that you need. So understanding is also that Jacobus mentioned you can develop a project in one area, but you need to access the grid. So make sure that not only do you have your option to lease agreement for your main site land, do I have my grid servitude agreements in place? So how am I getting to the grid connection? Have I engaged with those landowners, bearing in mind that those servitudes will be handed over to the system operator, in this case, Eskom? Do I have an access? So my access might be coming over another property. Have I concluded that agreement? Do I have a right of way to cross the property once the site is operational? So sometimes we get caught up in the excitement of wanting to develop a facility, and the focus is on the main site land for the development footprint, and we forget about the ancillary contracts that need to happen to gain lawful access to that land. And think long-term. As Chanda mentioned, always keep the end goal in mind. So when you're approaching the contractual side of things, look at what I'm going to need when I have a bid requirement. Look at what you're going to need when you reach financial close. And that seems like something in the very distant future when you're initially engaging with a landowner, with a different stakeholder, if it's communal property. But it is worth spending the time analyzing and making sure that you have the correct contractual structure in place, that you have the correct term in place. And like Jacobus mentioned, you have a 20-year lease. Does that lease agreement comply with requirements of SALA? Is the term correct? If it's a shorter term, what else do I need to have in place? Is the bank going to be happy with that? Is there financing on the property? So these are all factors that need to be considered, because at the end of the day, there is significant financial investment that is going to happen in order for you to be able to bring this project to fruition and to get it properly financed. Next slide, please. I think this slide maybe for me is the most important factor to consider. Jacobus mentioned very succinctly, but very importantly, it's people and not companies that we deal with. So what we need to ensure is that we have very good stakeholder relationships. You're not dealing with people over a short period of time. It's 7 to 10 years of development, then waiting for a REEP round and hopefully being successful in going into operations. And that communication is important. It's also a very easy way for us to ensure that accurate and relevant information is transferred between the developer and the landowner. There are lots of information that is seen in the national press, various publications. Landowners expect a return on the investment in their property. They are giving something that is of utmost importance to them. And I think that is something that sometimes we are not mindful of, that someone is trusting you with something that has been in their family for generations, that has a significant cultural sensitivity for them. And now you are asking them to trust, for them to trust you for the next 7 to 10 years. Ensure that you communicate, ensure that the information you disseminate to them is accurate and relevant. This also helps to dispel myths around renewable energy development. Often we see, it kills all the birds, you can't farm. So many negatives that exist. We're an industry that has been in this country for 10 years. And we need to dispel the myths around renewable energy development. It's also very significant when we look at the just energy transition. It's a challenge and an opportunity. And we need to ensure that the way we communicate in terms of what will be done with the land, how will renewable energy development take place, that we have factual, relevant information disseminated to our stakeholders. Furthermore, it's an opportunity to pass on market developments and to help educate on the benefits of renewable energy. So it's so much more than just having a renewable energy facility on your piece of land. It's the positive impacts to community and the country. It's building on what Jacobus and Chanda mentioned, the socioeconomic benefits, the economic inflows, it's much more of a broader positive impact than the potential negative environmental footprint of the installation of the facility. Next slide, please. I think I want to just close off by saying that, you know, one needs to be very, very cognizant of when you're approaching land development. Once you've identified that portion of land, be mindful of who and what you're engaging with. Be careful of the tick box exercise to just say, I have got the land. Ensure that you've got the correct information. And by that, I'm saying, make sure that your company name is correct. Make sure that there's not a spelling error in the name of the individual that you're putting down. These might seem insignificant, but when you're in a time-pressured scenario, bidding a project, trying to get a bank to invest at financial close, these are the areas that easily trip you up and can become a very expensive exercise. That's it from me. Thank you, Navesh.
Thank you very much, Masha. You've actually very concisely covered the fundamentals of land identification, site identification and land acquisition. So thank you very much for that. I see there are hands being raised. Unfortunately, we are unable to take live comments. Please can I request that you use the Q&A function to provide us with your questions, or the chat function to provide us with any comments. I'm going to move on to our next presenter, which is Inga Golds. Inga Golds is the manager, sorry about that.
No worries.
Manager of Site Assessment International at Juvi Renewable Energies. And she's going to be talking to us about energy resources assessments, wind particularly focused on.
Exactly, so many thanks. And also many thanks for listening to all of you. Yeah, I think we can just go straight into the presentation. Yeah, I think also we can skip the agenda. So next slide, please. Yeah, so as Jacobus already mentioned, first of all, it's really important to know where to find the high resource areas. So for that, we will have a look to the Wind Atlas of South Africa, which is an initiative of the South African government. Yeah, it's a high resolution wind resource map considering 19 metmasts with a measurement height of 62 meters. Yeah, and this map shows the wind speed at 100 meters, so from 2 meters per second in blue up to 10 meters per second in red. And yeah, the map gives us already a really good overview about the wind conditions in South Africa, and it helps us a lot to identify potential high resource areas. Yeah, so next slide, please. So once a potential site is identified, we will have a deeper look into the wind data. So therefore, we download 20 years of reanalysis data. So for example, ERA 5 or MERA 2 data. So both sources are available as 1 hourly data and have a grid resolution of 30 kilometers for ERA 5 and 50 kilometers for MERA 2. So they are also called mesoscale wind data. So with this data, we get already yeah, the long-term expected wind speed and wind direction condition, which helps us to decide if we want to go forward with this project or with the site. So if the wind condition still looks promising and we decide to go forward, we will start with a measurement campaign. So the one or the other might wondering why we do measurement campaigns if we have already the long-term wind speed or long-term data. Well, the main reason is that we need to consider local effects which are caused by hills, mountains, forests, or even deserts. So placing a met mast helps us, or with this we receive real on-site measurements, and therefore we can increase the quality of our planned project by reducing the uncertainties and the risks. Next slide, please. So how does a wind measurement mast setup looks like? So on the right side, you can see a setup drawing from installation report. So a met mast should consist of several anemometers placed at different heights, also at least of 2 wind vanes also installed at different heights. You also can measuring other components like temperature, pressure, etc. And of course, it should also have a data logger. So the most important thing is to set up the mast according to the IC guidelines and to calibrate the anemometers according to the MASnet. So the IC specifies the correct setup of a met mast. For example, it implements that the boom should be orientated depending on the type of met mast. So for lattice mast, it's 90 degrees orientation from prevailing wind direction. For tubular mast, it's 45 degrees. Furthermore, it describes to install a backup anemometer. Usually a backup anemometer is placed like around 2 meters below the main top anemometer. So just in case if the top anemometer fails or shows any malfunction, so we have one anemometer to cover the lost data. And also it says that we should install at least one other anemometer with a height difference of minimum 20 meters to be able to calculate the shear. The MASnet describes the process of a site assessment. So for example, it covers that a minimum measurement height of the met mast of at least 2/3 of the planned top height should be kept. Also, of course, we want to install the met mast on a representativeness radius, which means in simple terrain, the distance between met mast and turbine type can be up to 10 kilometers. In complex terrain, it's only up to 2 kilometers. Also, the measurement campaign should cover at least 1 year, so that we cover all the seasonal bias. And in the end, the data availability should be higher than 90%. Next slide, please. Thanks. So now I just want to give you a short overview about UWI's wind measurement campaigns. So currently we have measurement campaigns in Germany, Australia, and of course South Africa. On the left side, you can see a summary of all measurement campaigns which were ever done at UWI all around the world. As largest share, so here in blue, are the met mast measurements. They are most common and the acceptable measurements. But for example, in Germany, we changed like 4 years ago to LiDAR devices. This is fully accepted in Germany, which you can see here in gray. So we installed already more than 30 LiDAR devices, and this will be more in the future, of course. On the right side, I include as well a picture of a LiDAR inside a trailer. This is quite common in Germany. It's just for security reasons. So in South Africa, remote sensing is not yet fully accepted. So therefore, at least up to now, we use remote sensing only for prospecting sites, so before we install MetMasts. Yeah, I also include one picture of a MetMast, and above you can see picture of a cap anemometer just to get an idea of it. Yeah, next slide, please. So for data quality control, you need to ensure that the quality looks good. So at UWI, we do a daily check of the data receivement, a weekly rough check if the data looks plausible, and a quarterly detailed check where we look for gaps or any malfunctions. Therefore we use the software WinPro. So below I included a screenshot where you can see a few days of a measurement campaign. So on the top you can see the wind speed, and below the wind direction, so just to get an idea how it looks like. And also, for example, here in the wind direction, you can see that one wind vane, the blue one, failed. So this is something you try to fill and substitute with this quality checks. So after the quality check is done and we have 1 year or at least 1 year of data, best case, we do a long-term correction. This is an evaluation where the measurement is representative for a long-term period. So therefore, the concurrent period of the measurement and the reference data, for example, the error 5 from error 2 data, which I explained before, is used to determine a relationship between both data sets. So, and finally, we can start with the wind farm layouting or optimization. Normally, we do a preliminary layout before we have all the wind data. And as Jacobus mentioned it already, we have to consider several points. So one of the main points are the environmental conditions and restrictions. So we cannot place the turbines everywhere we want. Furthermore, especially in hilly terrain, we try to place the turbines in a higher elevation to gain more energy. And also we need to consider the main wind direction and the minimum distances. So I have one example here. Oh, can you go back one? Thanks. Here's one example. So where you can see how important a good layouting is. So considering the wind rows, so the main wind direction, and therefore also the minimum distances, we slightly changed the layout. So we changed the angle of the turbine row and could gain 2.3% more fuel, so which is quite a lot. So this was really short and quick an overview about the wind energy resource assessment. So many thanks for listening, and if you have questions, just let me know.
Thank you very much, Inga. I think there was quite a thorough technical presentation on assessing wind energy resources, especially here in South Africa. I'm going to move on very quickly to the next speaker. I see we're running out of time. So our next speaker is Dirk Tim, and he's also from UV Renewable Energies. He is an expert in yield simulations and technical expert modules. So Tim is going to talk to us about the energy resource assessment of solar PV specifically.
Thank you, Niveshan. So I want to start my presentation with the evaluation of different irradiation sources. Please one slide back to my agenda. So that is a main topic, or it's the essential point for for the yield go further with site investigations, because not only the irrigation source is important, it's also the surrounding and also the soiling study is important, as well as that is quite new, the albedo values. That means the ground reflection of the site of the ground. That is important for bifacial modules. Then in my next point, I want to go to the PV plant configuration, the requirements that came from either from the countries or also restrictions in regards of the grid. Then I want to go more in detail to the PV design. And I want to show also some, especially new topics for the requirement for modules, or not new topics, it's in general the certification of modules. And finally, then an example of a yield study and what is already all included in yield studies. So next slide, please. Everything is beginning with the iteration of a site, or when you're comparing sites with each other, you want in the first step to know how is the iteration for that region or for that site in special, and therefore different kind of sources are available. So for example, we have Solar-GIS maps. That is a first indication that you know already the global horizontal iteration, GHI. And also PVGIS is a free source to have satellite data for a specific site. That both sources are based on satellite data, whereas METEONORM is evaluation of meteorological stations in the surrounding. When 2 less stations are in place close to your site, then it is also using a share of satellite data compared with METEONORM stations or only satellite data. In the meantime, there's also METEONORM 8 available. So, and you see there you get different kind of radiation data. So it's really the first input is quite important because it has a high influence on your yield study. A typical meteorological year TMY file is minimum 10 years, average data, better 15 years. And in the meanwhile, for example, that Solar-GIS data are available, that satellite data are available for South Africa from 1994 up to now, with a grid resolution of 3 till 4 kilometers. That is quite a high resolution for satellite data. Okay, next slide, please. As mentioned, it is not only important to have that iteration data, that is the beginning. You need also get an impression of the site. So you must know if there are hills around, or if you're in a region with mountains. You must know if there are far shading occurs. And therefore you get such horizon file that we can see in the right picture on the top. So METEONORM, for example, also Solar-GIS data allows to get such horizon files when you put in your site coordinates quite accurate. And you see the sun path and see if you have a far shading due to hills and mountains. When you have quite closer shading objects like buildings or trees or something, then it is a good solution to go on the site and use devices like, for example, SunEye, or there are also some simple devices to get an overview of the shading in the surrounding. Next important point for energy yield simulations is for sure the soiling content. So it depends for sure, with the precipitation and days of rainfall. So when you have really a desert area with really no precipitation, it's you can assume a quite soiling loss also for when you have a high traffic region or industrial area, or when you build quite close to the sea. It's also often a challenge with soiling. So that must be all considered for yield simulations. And yeah, what is quite new is for sure that albedo values coming up with the bifacial modules. So in the past, it was not a topic with albedo values, but with bifacial modules, they have that gain from the rear side, and therefore it is important to know how is your underground. Is it white sand? Is it green grass? Or have you seasonal changes of the albedo values? That must all be detected. And here's an example on the right lower part, for example, for solar GIS data with albedo values. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, when you want to consider albedo values, you can make short-term measurements. So that is from some third-party institutes available that they go on site for 3 days till 1 week. That is possible when you have no seasonal shading, seasonal changes, and you can estimate you have a ground reflection that is always constant. And together with that mobile measurements for short term, you can also can do also the measurement of the horizon to know the shading objects in the surrounding. Typical, not common, is a 1 year measurement that is can be done for solar plants. That was in the past not really common. So you used always your solar GIS data or your data sources of TMY files and imported that in simulation programs like PVSYST. But that is quite new that you can also do 1 year measurements for solar. That is for sure. Then when you measure there the irradiation, it is not relevant for a long-term yield assessment, but you can compare that with satellite data and adjust the long-term satellite data with your measured global horizontal irradiation. And you can measure, for example, the albedo quite accurate that can be imported then in simulation programs over 1 year, as well as the soiling degree that you can see on in that picture with 2 modules, for example, and you see you keep 1 module soiled and 1 module cleaned, and measure there the soiling effect of the site. Yeah, and for the albedo measurement, you see on the right side that 2 parameters, one is facing up, one is facing down, to get an impression of that albedo value. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, when you do the PV plant configurations, you must first know the whole requirements. Gender spoke a lot of that about that already. So you need an impression about the available area, about soil conditions. So you must know if you have rocks in the on the ground, or if you have sand, or if you have limiting obstacles that you must consider overhead lines, or like in the picture, you have trees in front of your PV plant, or drainage areas, or flooding areas. That must all be known before you can start your PV design. And you have also perhaps electrical restrictions that it's only allowed to build up a maximum AC capacity that is only allowed to feed in 75 megawatt, for example, or 10 megawatt is often in Germany a limit. That must be known. Then sometimes it's also given a DC-AC ratio that is also quite different in the different countries. So in the US, they use a high DC-AC ratio and put really a lot of modules to inverters also with the known that in the afternoon you have a lot of clipping losses and the inverter limits their power, but they want quite early in the morning and in the evening a straight profile, and so it's like a rectangle profile that they get at the end, but that is really different in the different countries, and also choose of the EPC what makes sense. Then also given power factors is one topic, or the energy demand, that you get a profile of the energy demand, and you have to build your PV plant as best, perhaps also together with battery systems, to fulfill that energy demand. Okay, next slide, please. After that, you can start with your PV design, and the first topic is for sure, or the first question is, what kind of system design do you want to use? So is it more a fixed tilt system, or an east-west tracker system, or east-west fixed is also possible. East-west fixed is more when you have really a quite less land available, and your site is quite small, and you want to pack as much as possible, or want to install as much as possible PV power, then an east-west fixed tilt can make sense. East-west tracker is really common in South Africa, but makes, for example, not really sense in Germany, as it is from the irrigation perspective, and also from the land perspective. You need more land to build really to increase really the capacity. And with that comparison of that systems, you must investigate the best energy output, LCOE, and the BOS costs. And then you can also start with the module selection. So bifacial is a big topic since I would say beginning last year. But makes also not in all cases sense. So even when the land is limited, it's difficult to get a real gain of bifacial modules. As you need for bifacial modules, you need a larger row-to-row distance. The tables must be not too high. You must build higher above the ground. Your ground must be as possible more wide, or must be not too dark, let's say. That increases the bifacial gain, and therefore it makes not for every site sense. Then in the last time, there was a big improvement in the modules. So then increased a lot their cell size from M6 format with 166 millimeter cell sizes to M10 with 182 millimeter and M12. So we have, for that M6 cell size, we have about 410 watt modules. M10 cell size, it's about 550 watt modules, and M12 also in that range, 550, 570 watt modules. Then for sure it is the choice of the inverter. Do you want to go with central inverters or string inverters? It's also a question of maintenance, and for example, if you are on islands, it makes perhaps more sense to build with string inverters instead of central inverters in regards of maintenance. And for sure, also the tracker system or fixed tilt system, you have to investigate if you want to build with a 1P tracker and 1 module in portrait or 2 in portrait. For fixed tilt, the table's getting larger and larger with 2P, 3P modules. So means 3 modules in portrait. That are all investigations that should be done. And then you can start with your system design and build your modules per string. DC-AC ratio can be considered, strings per DCP and per racking system, the row distances, and so on. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, that is a short digression about requirements for modules. So essential is the first both IEC certificates. So the IEC 61, 215 and 730 that are essential because they are for safety qualification and type approval. So in that IEC standards, the module run through several tests in laboratories that they must fulfill, and for safety regulations, and also for quality insurance. And then additional IC certificates we typically request, like for PID tests, for salt mist corrosion tests, especially when you are built quite close to the sea. Sand blowing test, important for desert areas, ammonia corrosion test. But there are a lot of more IC certificates that must be requested, depending also on your site sometimes, and on your site conditions, let's say. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, and final, when you have done all that investigations and estimated your soiling losses, estimated your input your irrigation data into your energy yield program, you can run a simulation or several simulations with different kind of systems. Here you see, for example, a system also on a hill. You see the shading scenery on the left side with the trees, and with to get an impression of the shading of the trees, and also from the road to road distances. Own shading of the tables. And then you get at the end a report with the all the climate conditions. So you have in that report the inserted global horizontal irradiation, temperatures, and the whole energy output, and also the performance ratio of your PV plant. You see what you can feed in the grid. And you see as well all the losses on the right side that are assumed either with soiling, for example, or that can or are calculated from the program, and that gives at the end the total yield. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, there I'm at the end with my presentation. Thanks a lot for joining. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Dirk. I think there was extremely important technical considerations both you and Inga have provided for participants who are looking to choose a particular technology. And it's really the difference between building a renewable project and building a very successful renewable energy project. So thank you for that. And I think it was very useful for everyone. Our last presentation today is going to be done by Mike Mangnall, who is the Managing Director of WKN Wind Current, in a segment of the webinar that we call the Developer Spotlight. And this is basically where we have developers come and showcase what they've done in their years of existence, how they've developed their companies, and what kind of opportunities are available for others trying to enter this space. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Navashen, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in this webinar and sponsor this webinar, which I'm finding extremely interesting and very valuable. So thanks again, and the chance to just briefly introduce our company, WKN Wind Current, South Africa. Next slide, please. So WKN Wind Current is a subsidiary of a German IPP, or independent power producer, called WKN. And WKN in turn is then fully owned by the P&E Group, which is also a German IPP based in northern Germany, just outside Hamburg. And we've been part of that group since 2013. The company is a pioneer in the wind energy sector, in Europe in particular, and for the last 25 years have been developing projects in the sector. They are leading developer of wind farms in Germany in particular, with over 3 gigawatts realized of onshore wind projects. They also do operations and maintenance for their own wind farms as well as other wind farms, primarily in Germany, and have done more than 1.5 gigs of those. We have a history of being very successful in offshore wind projects, which is not in South Africa yet, but might be. And we've done 8 of those over our history. More than 5 gigawatts of projects have been realized to date. And in terms of investments generated and secured, more than 10 billion euros to date. We have an attractive pipeline going forward of in excess of 5 gigs and have started the development of our first solar PV projects recently. Just briefly, a map of, I see our locations haven't come up in this particular map. Maybe another press of the button, but in essence, we're on 3 continents, primarily in Europe, but also in the States, in Canada, and then down in South Africa, where we are based, and we have in excess of 400 employees across the world. In terms of what we offer, a very experienced business development model, offering and operating across the full spectrum, the full range and life cycle of a typical wind farm development, from the early days, which has been spoken a lot about today, from the acquiring of the site to the analyzing of the wind and the solar, through getting in initial offers from turbine providers and I suppose panel providers. And then where a lot of our work sits is around obtaining the many permits and licenses that one needs before you can bid. And then finally, if you're successful, construct and operate your projects. But then in Germany, we have a very big financing and sales team, which does look at the financial analysis, the competitiveness of a project, as well as its legal basis, which, as Marisha outlined, is extremely important. And then we either hold on to our projects or sell them on, and then arrange project financing for those along the way. We have a big and very experienced construction team based primarily in Germany, and they've been hard at work at a couple of wind farm sites of late in Poland and Sweden, and one recently reached COD, which was close to about 130 megawatt project. So the team is really doing really well. So in essence, we operate as an IPP, an independent power producer, with very close links to the utilities, to infrastructure funds for partnering and funding, as well as insurance companies and other IPPs potentially. And then we do have a service delivery team which can provide services to both our own wind farms as well as other wind farms. But not only wind farms, we, as I said, are looking now at PV and have acquired a number of sites. And as well as the new hot potato, I guess, is storage and linking those to your wind and or solar farms, together with new technologies and things like power to X, which could be power to gas, liquids, heat, you name it. So we are considering all of those. Next slide, please. So in South Africa, WK and Wind Current, we've been around for 10 years. We focus primarily on project development, as I said, looking at securing land leases, contracting the land, doing the wind measurements, and doing the analysis ourselves. Together with consultants, you can't do it all yourselves, as has been said before. Critically optimizing one's site is throughout the different stages of the development, which is very important to ensure you are competitive along the way. So ultimately you have a product that can win during the bid rounds, can financially close successfully, and can then deliver during the construction and, importantly, the 20-year operations phase. And our strength does sit within getting the different planning and environmental approvals and the many others that Jacobus outlined, and then involved in selling these projects as soon as they are ready to tender. We then support the investor through the bid process if needed, as well as through the financial close process. Being part of the P&E group, however, does give us an extensive access to in-house expertise. So as explained earlier, we have a big project financing team. We have a procurement team which has very close relationships to the big turbine suppliers, for example, and then we can execute and have done so globally. Also well connected to the wind industry globally through such as to the big turbine suppliers, the big international lenders, the banks, and other technical experts as required. In South Africa, we have a substantial portfolio of EIA-approved wind projects and are currently busy developing and starting the development of a large greenfield pipeline of wind and solar projects going forward, which we can then offer for future tender opportunities, both government, the REEP program at the moment, as well as private offtake opportunities, which is definitely on the uptake in South Africa. And as I mentioned, we will be also developing a substantial PV pipeline from later this year. I think there might be a slide missing there. Marlies, what's the next slide? Yeah, there's a slide missing. If you can just go back one, I will just talk to what I was going to say. But basically, we are based in Cape Town. We are a small development team, primarily project developers. You can see some of them in the photo on the right there on one of our site excursions. But however, we also have an in-house wind and sites expert, as we call them, plus two very capable people that are focused on securing land, which was spoken about earlier, which is extremely important. And we do have an extensive network of landowners that we keep up to date on a regular basis and ensure they know where they stand with regards to the progress of the projects and when those projects are likely to then be successful. So that's the core of what we do. I think I'll leave it there. And again, thank you. Just the final slide is my contact details, so please do get in touch if you have any questions. And yes, we're open to questions and answers in what time's left. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you to the audience who have stayed with us throughout the duration of the session. We are running a few minutes over. We're going to run a few minutes over. But without wasting any more time, let me hand over to Ntombifuthi Ntuli, who is the CEO at SAWEA, who's going to facilitate the Q&A session. Can I ask for us to take down the presentation, please, colleagues? And can I ask for the speakers to turn on your videos? I hope the network is going to sustain all of our videos, but I think it's just nicer for us to engage with our videos on, please. Over to you, Ntombi.
Thank you, Niveshan, and thanks to all our presenters. This has been a very informative and educational episode of our Developing Developers series. And I'd like to thank our participants as well for asking the questions. It means we're paying attention. And judging by the number of participants and the number of questions received, it also means that the presentations were clear enough, as I've managed to group the questions, so I don't think we'll take much time. I'd like to ask the speakers to keep it very brief when answering the questions, just stick to the point, bearing in mind that we are running out of time. Okay, so I've got a group of questions, and there was a lot of questions regarding land-related matters, so I would like to just jump straight into those. I think most likely for Mesha, Chanda, and Jacobus would be most likely to answer that. The first question is, I'm gonna ask these questions in a group because they are very much related, so that when you give your responses, you are able to combine related matters. Can you build a wind project in a residential area, say a small wind farm? Another one asked, what about state-owned land? What is your take on developing on NGO-owned land in South Africa? How do you structure the lease agreement for communal land? Are lenders willing to fund renewable energy facilities located on communal land? Does the proposal of the policy for land expropriation without compensation pose a risk to the development of renewable energy projects? And then before I hand over to Mesha, I would like ask this one. How are developers able to secure land on a list risk basis pending a preferred bidder award? And I think this question was asked on a basis that you need to access the land to install Mast and carry out required land. How do you deal with landowner expectations and expectations of compensation during development stage? So I'll hand over to the panelists, just try and address parts of that question, and where you are not sure, pass on to the next presenter. Can I start with Alicia?
Sure, Ntombi, thank you. I think the residential matter is a quick one to answer. We have to respect buffers, and buffers are distances away from residential homes because there is visual impact, there's health and safety impacts, there's shadow flicker impacts, a number of studies that we do. And also we find in a residential environment, the resource might not be sufficient to justify utility scale. And remember, we are talking utility scale, large scale investments here. State-owned land, it's not prohibited. It just means a different level of negotiation, and you engage with the Department of Public Works, and they have a mechanism whereby you enter into a lease agreement with them. Again, also understanding that because of the timeframes in terms of the PMFA, you would always lease and not procure. So in terms of state-owned land, it can be done. Just means engaging with the Department of Public Works. For communal land, it all comes down to title deed, title deed, title deed. And Jacobus, I'll hand over to you to go into more detail on this. It's not prohibitive. It just means that you need to have a different level of stakeholder engagement. It is more people focused, and to satisfy lender requirements, because banks will finance it. But as long as you can prove that the persons who are part of that, or say that they are owners of that communal land, that the deed of title is associated with that individual. And in terms of land expropriation, it is not a huge risk for renewable energy projects because the lease agreements have the transfer of the right of ownership. So it will move with whomever the owner is. And that extends to option to leases at development phase, and also for projects that are under either construction or in operations already. So we have de-risked that. And in terms of compensation, it is a conversation that you need. It's that sweet balance of landowner expectation versus the long time frame, and understanding that there is a shared risk, because we could have delays in the REEP program, which neither the developer anticipates or the owner can expect compensation during a time of no income. So it comes down again to people and not companies, having that stakeholder relationship and engagement, and balancing the risk reward. And I'll hand over to Jacobus.
Thank you, Mersha. I'm going to go in reverse there from where you ended in terms of that balance with land and expectation. It's a very, very difficult conversation quite often to explain to a landowner that, hey, you know, we're putting in all this risk to develop this land. There's no guarantees. We don't have cash flow yet necessarily. And people are saying to you like, hey, but yeah, you know, I want annual lease fees. So it's a difficult conversation to kick the ball down a curb and say, hey, if you take this risk with me at a low cost, then the rewards are going to be so much more later on. When you can't overcome that, what you often have to do is just to be sure that you, once again, to the point that I made in my presentation, in terms of the financial backing, do you have the financial backing to put in this capital for indefinite period of time, because of the indefinite period of time coming in because of the policy uncertainty and the process. So do you guys see the domino effect? Yeah, so if we have more policy certainty, then these answers are going to become a lot easier to answer, and it's going to be a lot easier for you to look a landowner in the eye and say, hey, I don't have the money now, but I can guarantee you that I'm going to have it in 5 years or in 3 years. In a perfect utopia, it's a lot easier than saying to them, hey, I don't have the money now, I also don't really know when I will. So yeah, that makes it tough. Then coming back to the communal land, I think, Mersha, you answered that so succinctly, but just once again, the title deed. What you will find quite often is that on the title deeds of communal land, it doesn't exactly necessarily vest in a trust. There's a lot of land that's governed by the Department of Traditional Affairs and Cooperative Governance, where the land is still marked on the title deed as the Republic of South Africa. So when you write your contract or when you register your contract, you need to have the owner's consent, and now the owner is the Republic. Who do you talk to? What department do you talk to? Where do you take this? That's the one issue that we have. Another issue that you have on communal land is not often surveyed very well, and very well, the smaller units you might have. I'm going to take example the Moshaweng area. It's the old Bophuthatswana homeland around Kuruman and John Tohologa, SAPVIA, and what you get there is a vast expanse of land, the size of a small European country, but with many tribal councils working and functioning on that one property. So who do you contract with, and where does this boundary end? Who gets the money? You have vast communities living onto it. And then last point on that, also, if there is a correct detail in terms of what trust the land belongs to, often these trusts comprise of members. That's a whole community. And I know it's difficult enough to satisfy 10 landowners on a project development. If a trust comprises of 500 participants, getting all of those people to agree on something becomes so tedious that it's almost impossible to reach timeframes and timelines. And that often causes for divestment. Thank you, that's all.
Thanks, Jacobus. And while you are on that, there's an interesting question that just came in about, can landowners sign agreements with several developers, obviously understanding that not all of them are going to win the projects, basically just play a gamble a bit. And then the last one on land, which I think you can also take, is what is the minimum size to be profitable? Are there any ratios or benchmark of megawatt per hectare that one can use?
That's actually more difficult to answer than you would think. But just to start on the many developers, I would like to see a development company that will write up a contract in such a way that it will be possible for their competitors to also function on the property. Because what happens in the bidding process quite often is that you have a piece of land and you don't necessarily win the project that you have developed that land on in that bidding round, let's say bidding round 4. Then you want to be able to hold on to that asset for the next bidding round 5. So you don't want to, you don't really want it to be a free for all for everybody involved. I see a lot of smiles from Mike there, so I think he knows exactly what I'm talking about, also from Chanda. And then, yeah, just in terms of the size, a little bit more difficult to answer because my speciality is most certainly in terms of wind. And the problem is you place your turbines where you have the optimal wind resource. So those turbines can be 1 kilometer apart, or those turbines can be 10 kilometers apart, and you build roads in between, and you build power lines in between. But a safe assumption, yeah, I have seen 140 megawatt wind farms that covers, in terms of all the properties they involve, well in excess of 3,000. Yes, that's even that's. I mean, 30,000 hectares. I mean, basically, I've seen a project where, I don't know if you know Cape Town, but just to orientate yourself, where the southernmost turbine is in Muizenberg and the northernmost turbine is in Atlantis, just in terms of distance scale. But if you took the actual infrastructure footprint, I think a safe assumption is almost to say, which I usually work with, is about 150 hectares per 140 megawatts. So it's almost a one-to-one relationship. But then I'm saying, you only take the foundation, and you only measure the road, and you only measure the cable. So it's not an easy answer. And
Yeah.
I think Chanda would be better to answer in terms of the PV area that we need.
So maybe,
Okay.
again, I'd look at it slightly differently in terms of, if your question is to know whether a project is going to be feasible from an investment point of view, you need to understand who's lending you the money and how much they want back on it. So what your interest rates are going to be. So you have to work all of these things in, and what are your costs of if it's the wind, what are your costs of your turbines, what are the cost of all of your inputs, and then what do you have left to understand then the feasibility, and that's what you do in the whole feasibility study, the feasibility of your solar plant or your wind farm. So it's not necessarily just a ratio of space. It takes, when we had out that whole list of things that you have to take into consideration, those all feed into your financial model and then spit out a value as to whether it's going to be worthwhile for someone to lend you the money to build the project, and you will be able to have a viable return on that investment. And it's a very long-winded way of saying it's a very difficult question to answer.
let's leave it there, Chanda. I think you guys gave it the best shot. Maybe moving on to the grid connection questions. There was a question about distance for location of solar or wind energy facilities nearest to the grid connection point. But thanks to Rian Smith, he's answered that on chat. And I'm going to ask the next question. Who pays for the grid connection infrastructure, like power lines and substations? Is it Eskom, municipality, IPP developers? I think Jacobus answered this in his presentation. You pay it yourself, and if I heard correctly, you transfer to Eskom. But I think asked differently would be, do IPPs get compensated for building this infrastructure? Can we take that one, Jacobus?
So, okay, so basically I can only speak for how we usually do it. So first and foremost, ideal would be to go in where there's not a lot of upgrading needed, but wherever you need to build lines. So you have a distribution line. If you build your own substation for the project and you have to build a distribution line, that's 132 kV and upwards. 132 kV, you need a distribution license. Generally, IPPs do not get in distribution license. So what happens is, if you build, Eskom wouldn't necessarily have the capacity to build a line or want to build a line, so they will give you a cost estimate letter. So, and then what is going to cost for them to do their monopoly works that only they can do, so you pay the money to them, and then you add with that the infrastructure you have to build yourself, and then you transfer everything beyond the IPP switch yard from your grid, you transfer to Eskom. So that often when I said something about grid connection where you have servitudes where you go over people's lands, those servitudes also goes towards Eskom. It does not remain with the IPP. Those are not land rights and infrastructure that we keep for ourselves. So it's a cost to the IPP, but it's an asset to the country.
Okay. No, thanks for that. That was nice and precise. And then with regards to economic development, somebody asked, why did government approve the rates, renewable energy development zones? Does it not exacerbate inequality with regards to expected socioeconomic benefits associated with renewables? So that's one question. The other question related to economic development, for both solar and wind specialists, DTI local content requirements is in many instances onerous to developers. Expensive technical equipment cannot be sourced locally and impacts on local content spend as a percentage of CAPEX. Is there a specific database of local content suppliers for wind and solar equipment? And are there, in addition, any specific technical equipment that is excluded from the local content requirements? I think, yeah, was it Jacobus that touched on this?
Yeah, okay, lots of questions for me today. So on the local content, it's a very good question. There's not one database where you get your local content suppliers. Now, in terms of renewable energy, there's a finite amount of suppliers that can supply you with the key equipment. Now, key equipment is often listed as certain items. That's your solar panels, that's your PV panels, that's your turbines, your nacelles, your towers, your inverters, all of that and more. I mean, I'm just brushing on top of it. So there's a lot of suppliers. So at the end of the day, your EPC contractor, if it's not yourself, is going to look at cast the net far and wide and go do some market research yourself. So I think it is on the IPP yourself to do market research, and that's also those relationships that you build, and that remains market intel. So if you're going to go around and say, yeah, you know, I've got a list of I've got a list of suppliers out there, and everybody's going to compete for the attention of the same suppliers. Because let's take wind turbines, for instance. There's a finite amount of wind turbine suppliers out there. There's a lot of people that want to bid, and a lot of people want to gain the assurances that they're going to have that wind turbine supplier to put them first in line when manufacturing starts. And that comes with certain, so there's always a race on that. So it's not just one finite list. What I well and truly can say is, if I've now called a few suppliers, for instance, for PV panels, and I see that, shucks, I can't find anybody that can reach my local content threshold, then you call the DTIC. And they're very helpful. And there will be a person there that will tell you, okay, who have you called? Who have you spoken to? Have you tried this and this and this? And those people, they will point you in the right direction. But there's not, as far as I'm aware, an active database in place.
Right.
Tommy, can you just, the first question?
Okay, the first question is fine. I'd like Mike to touch on that as a developer on the rates. Why? The question is, why did government approve the renewable energy development zones? Is it not going to disadvantage other communities in terms of expected socioeconomic benefits?
Yeah, big question. I think that the main reason government developed them and is still continuing to update them on a regular basis is to try to be strategic about where wind farms and solar farms happen in the country. You know, many have happened, but there's still many more to come. So are they being located in the best possible locations when you look at a whole range of factors, including technical, environmental, but also socioeconomic? And I know that those factors have been taken into consideration. There is a criteria around how sort of impoverished certain areas are. And then the poorer those areas are, they are given certain higher scores, and therefore you are supposed to be drawn towards those areas. But it does take, you know, a whole mix of factors when deciding on where to locate. And I think no one will be disadvantaged. A site will always be developed where most suitable from all aspects, and where ultimately it can be financially successful, constructed, and then operated.
And I think most importantly, it's environmental considerations of those areas that are being assessed. Yes. Thanks, Mike. I'm gonna want to close now because we are running out of time with just two questions, one for Inga and one for Dirk. Resource assessment, must wind measurements be conducted every 10 kilometers on a wind farm? How long does the process of wind assessment take? And why is LiDAR not acceptable in measuring wind resources in South Africa? That's for Inga. And
Okay.
then for Dirk, what do I absolutely need for the resource assessment testing for a solar PV farm?
So the 10 kilometers in simple terrain is a recommendation of the MESNAT. I mean, if possible, of course, you should do it, but energy assessment is always related to uncertainty assessment. So in case that it's not possible to install for any reason, you just need to increase the uncertainties. So it's a matter, of compensation, and depends really on the site as well. The solar and LiDAR device, I was referring to the REEP program. I think it's still in discussion if it will be accepted or not. Especially like how to say, like only measurements, only remote sensing measurements might be a problem. But yeah, let's see. I cannot explain why. So also I think it's a matter of also turbulence assessment. So yeah, and reliability. What's the third question? Sorry.
Okay, I'll tell you now. The third question: why is LiDAR not acceptable in measuring wind resources?
Yeah, this I said. So it's not. I cannot really comment on it. It really yeah, it's a REEP decision. And
Can I jump in on that
yeah,
one?
sure, of course.
I think when the REEP was designed, the IPP office and the advisors were trying to minimize the risk as far as the tender process was concerned. So you'll see that a lot of the requirements that were in the round one, they lessened as you went through the rounds, but you had to have certification for the turbines, you had to have certain track record and things like that. And so it was basically so that the projects were guaranteed to perform. And as far as IPP office were concerned, the gold standard was a met mast at 2/3 of hub height. And so at the time when they did it, because you have to remember it was a long time ago, right? It was 2009, 2010 that they first designed it. LiDAR and SODAR weren't so widely accepted. And so we don't know what, in the upcoming rounds it might change, but that doesn't stop you as a developer from using that technology to do correlations, but you still have to have the MetMast just because that was the best practice internationally at the time.
Okay, thanks, Chanda. And last one for Dirk. You got the question?
Yeah, so absolutely necessary is really the irradiation data to get an exact file. So measurements are not really necessary in the beginning, let's say, especially when you build with monofacial modules. It is the albedo value is not necessary, and even when you build with bifacial modules, you can estimate the albedo value out of let's say tables. There are some pictures to estimate the underground and the reflections that you can put in your yield study to get that albedo values. And but the most important thing is really to have that TMY file from a good solar source, like satellite data or from a met station.
All right, thank you. I think I'm going to stop it here with the questions. I have captured all the questions from the Q&A function and in the chat, and we are going to send some of the unanswered questions to the panelists and hopefully be able to get back to participants with answers for those questions. So at this point, I would like to thank all the panelists for dedicating your time to educating South Africa about the renewable energy industry. It's very important. And as I've always said before, there are people who are looking into the industry and wondering, where do I start? Where do I go for information, and who can assist me? So the information that was shared today was very important. And we thank you for that. I would like to thank also our partners, the IPP office, the Renewable Energy Forum of Entrepreneurs Forum of South Africa, and Black Energy Professionals Association for supporting us in putting together this capacity building initiative. And then most importantly, I would like to thank our sponsor for this particular webinar today, WKN Current. You've heard from Mike, and we really appreciate your participation and actually showing that developers can educate and support aspiring developers in the renewable energy space. And then lastly, I would like to thank our series sponsors, Mainstream Renewable Power and Juvie, for the support and providing us with experts to come and present in this different webinars that we've always had. So without further ado, I would like to say thank you very much. Most importantly to our team, the SAWEA and SAPVIA team, for all the hard work that goes into putting together this kind of online events. And then thank you all the participants for dialing in. I think at most we reached about 300 number of participants. It also shows that this is a very important initiative that South Africa would like to learn more from the renewable energy industry. So I think I've said enough. Thank you very much for dialing in, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm extremely grateful for the amount of detail that you guys have provided in your presentations, and I'm very grateful for that. So thank